The following program is a production of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Ira Flatow. I'm Eileen Cavanagh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is Ira Flatow. Welcome, Ira.
Nice to be here.
Ira is the author of They All Laughed, From Light Bulbs to Lasers, the fascinating story behind the great inventions that have changed our lives. And I agree with the subtitle, every one of these inventions has changed our lives. You're currently host of the NPR Weekly Science Talk Show, and you were a science reporter for CBS This Morning in NPR's All Things Considered. Did these positions help you make science interesting and attractive for the ordinary person?
I sure hope so. I wasted a lot of time.
If you didn't.
Yeah, they did. Actually, they were challenges, especially when doing radio, and how to present something that is visually interesting that you would watch on television on the radio. Two of my greatest successes were one, I got a letter from a mother one day saying her children were going into the closet and chewing wintergreen lifesavers. And I said, what are you doing in the closet together? I'm a little worried about this. And they said, no, nothing, Mom. They spark in the dark when you chew them. I waited about a year to figure out how to do this. And I then recreated that event on the air with my co-host Susan Stamberg at that time. And we did a whole story about the science of why wintergreen lifesavers spark in the dark. And it was just terrific.
And can you tell us briefly?
Well, this is something called triboluminescence. It's a phenomenon where if you take a sugar molecule and you crush it quickly, it gives off a high voltage. And you can't see it because it's in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. But that little wintergreen impurity changes it back to the visual part so you can actually see it. And this is, and you know, you think that, and I talk about this in the book, you think that you've discovered something new all the time. I got letters from physics teachers around the country the next day saying, we've been doing this for years. I've been doing this. And they said, you know how old this is? That it's so old that people were writing about it 300 years ago. You know, people have sugar in little cubes now and they have it in little packets, but they used to store sugar in the cellar. And, you know, in giant clumps, weight of a few pounds each. And how would you get the sugar? You'd go downstairs in the dark and you'd take an ice pick and you'd bang a chip piece of it off of it that way. And they, of course, they noticed that all the time. Every time they hit the sugar, they'd see it sparking. So you really rediscovered the wheel, but you know, you did it in such an interesting way that you've made an educational subject out of it. So that's challenges like that I love. And there was once a challenge. There was an oil tanker that grounded off the coast of Nantucket, near Massachusetts there. And Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and there was a tremendous oil spill that was spilling all this oil and fouling the wildlife, the ocean floor. And I said, how can I do this on the radio? So I took a 10-gallon fish tank and recreated the oil spill. I was sloshing it around. You could hear us sloshing the water around. I got number 6 heating oil, and like we talked about I got Susan Stamberg to react to it as if she were watching it. Look, the oil is globbing up and it's becoming, you know, it's floating. Some of it's sinking to the bottom. And I said, that's exactly what's happening at the oil spill out there in the ocean. So these challenges have been terrific, and I really enjoyed finding
So in that
ways.
instance, you had to learn to speak in a visual kind of fashion, and I think that's reflected in your book, or at least it
I hope
seems
so.
to me that, as you were relating in the first incident, many of these inventions, it seemed to me, you know, you sort of think the microwave oven kind of came out in the store and when it got cheap enough to boil.
That's right.
I don't know whether everyone is naive as I am, but that's sort of my view of a lot of these inventions. And what you seem to point out in many of them is that these developed over a long period of time. And for instance, the microwave oven weighed 750 pounds and was used in ships and trains long before probably the average homemaker ever heard about it.
And not only that, a lot of these inventions were never set out to be invented. A lot of them were done by accident. For example, the microwave oven. No one sat down one day and said, hey, let's invent a microwave oven. You know, it sprang out of an accident where a scientist was walking in the laboratory past an operating radar set, and he noticed a candy bar melted in his pocket, and he was inquisitive to wonder why that was. Other people, if it had been someone else, he might have said, oh goodness, a terrible laundry dry cleaning bill I have here, and thought it was his body heat that melted it. But he was inquisitive enough to look at the tube that was making the radar work and notice that maybe we can take that same sort of tube, put it in a box with some food, and make a new kind of oven out of it, create a new technology. And there are lots of times that people, depending on your personality, depending upon who you are and how you look at life, whether you look at life as just something to get by and go from day to day, or whether you look at life as a challenge every day to experience it in its totality. And lots of inventors are that way too. The good inventors look at new things in life or unusual things in life, and they ask, why does it work that way? How does it work that way? Instead of just saying, oh, that's nice. You know, and I think that's what separates a lot of these inventors who, for example, Alexander Graham Bell did not set out to invent the telephone. In fact, he knew that the telephone could probably be invented. And his competitors who were working to create other machines knew that the telephone could be invented. But Bell was fortunate enough that he came from a family. His father used to teach speech to the deaf. So he was, his whole life he spent hearing sounds and the spoken word and things like that. So when he found out that it's possible to make a telephone, he naturally wanted to do it because he thought speaking was a wonderful thing that occurred. Whereas his competitors laughed at him, and they said, there's no money to be made in the telephone. The real money is to be made in the telegraph, which is what they were trying to invent at that time. So, but he was smart enough and wise enough, and he was naive enough, so to speak, to go ahead and invent the telephone. And even after it was invented, people still laughed at him about it just being a toy. But who's laughing now, as they say?
Is that a thread? Were every single one of these inventions that you mentioned in the book laughed at? Not
every single one of them, but a lot of them were made or invented out of the ordinary experience that we might expect. And I mean by that, where the stories behind them are stranger than if Hollywood had written a script. A lot of serendipity takes place in these things. For example, Ben Franklin and his kite. It's not an invention, but it's really what got me started to thinking about truth being stranger than fiction and how a lot of what we think to be true is really not true. It's folklore. For example, everybody learns that Ben Franklin discovered electricity when lightning struck his kite. Well, lightning never struck his kite, because if it had, he'd be a crispy critter, you know? And then as I went through the book, I learned that Franklin was not the first to do this experiment to try to draw electricity out of clouds. It was done in France a month before he was.
And did he actually know that? Did he sort of model his on?
No, he described the experiment. The reason they did it in France is that Franklin described an experiment in which if you take a rod and you put it high enough in the sky, you can draw electricity from a cloud. Now, why would you want to do that? Not to get zapped by electricity. Well, in those days, they didn't know what electricity was. And on the earth, on the ground, all they had was static electricity, stuff that makes your clothes cling to each other. Well, Franklin would see the electricity coming out of clouds in the form of lightning, and he wanted to know whether it was the same kind of electricity that was in the sky that we had on the ground. And he used to experiment with this stuff on the ground all the time. So he said, how do we get it out of the sky? Well, let's see if we can put a metal rod up there and draw some of it. He knew if you drew too much of it, you were going to get killed. So he described how to stick a pole up in the air and draw it off. But he couldn't wait for a church steeple in Philadelphia to be built high enough to put this rod up in the sky. Meanwhile, the French scientists learned about this, and they did build a little pole and drew electricity out of the sky and proved what he said they would find. And he became an overnight hero. The King of France loved him. He became an icon in France. And he performed the experiment a month later. He got tired of waiting for the steeple, so he built the kite and put the rod on the kite. And in fact, there's a great tie into the American Revolution here, because Franklin was so well loved in France, even 20 years later when the Revolution started, that when he went over to the King of France and asked for assistance to help the revolutionaries, he said, I'll give you anything you want, because you're a terrific guy. Now, if he had just been a poor printer, and maybe a post office person, a librarian, that came over begging, he might not have even gotten the door open. They would have said, stay on the boat,
So networking took place, and the old boys networked.
Well, I mean, these are sort of serendipitous. This is how history gets tied together into one string. And so I always say that instead of shooting off fireworks on the 4th of July, there's nothing more patriotic than flying a kite. It's a better connection to it.
Well, and you've pointed out too, that there are a lot of those kinds of connections that have to take place, that very often the inventions were invented, the world was not ready for them.
Right.
And so they found no market. So you need
Right.
an inventor, you need markets, you need an ability to manufacture it, you need somebody who's going to buy it, you need an acceptability. So
That's right.
One of the fun things I think this book pointed out is how many things need to fall into place at the right time.
Just to follow your lead, one of the most famous examples of that was the typewriter. And the typewriter was invented in a certain period, the 1800s, right before it should have been, right before its time, because people could not figure out what to do with it. Now you can look around in your office and your home and say, how could they not know what to do with a typewriter? Mark Twain bought one, but he was about the only author or writer who did. It's an interesting phenomena that the inventors didn't think about, or if they had, they thought they could change things. In those days, everything was written by hand, and your penmanship and your handwriting was a message in itself to the receiver. You would look at your letter and see the way you wrote it, how it was written, how nicely you wrote, and that would tell him something about your character. So the only things that were not written by hand were junk mail, flyers, posters, things like that. And if you sent a typewritten letter, a business letter or a personal letter to someone else, they would just throw it out. They wouldn't even open it up. They'd see the printing on the envelope or something, or they'd open it up and see it was printed. They'd just chuck it out thinking it was somebody trying to get you to buy something. Only when the office situation around America changed, only when you had accountants and many accountants working in one office, or lots of people who had to handwrite things to read to other people, and you then had to have legible handwriting so everybody could read it, not just yourself, then somebody probably say, hey, look, there's a machine with lots of little buttons on it that makes very legible printing. Let's bring that into the office. And that's when the typewriter became accepted, not years and years before when it was invented.
I think that's fascinating that it was sort of polite to send a handwritten note, and some of that still remains in Emily Post, saying you must handwrite a thank you note.
Yes.
I wondered, just as you were speaking, how much this influences the fact that we no longer learn the Palmer method of handwriting, that standardized kind of form that perhaps businesses...
Yeah, and we don't... I know my handwriting is terrible. It's probably because I use a typewriter so much. And my mother was the first one to say, why don't you learn the Palmer method when I was... And they just... And in fact, at that point, they didn't teach it in school.
Because nobody taught it
Nobody
anymore.
taught it in school
Right.
anymore.
Right. I was amazed at my own children how, anything goes when they, however they like to write was fine. So in a sense, the invention, we are changed by the invention as well as, it works both ways.
Yes, technology certainly influences, it makes us have more time for ourselves. I mean, I think one of the problems with handwriting is that we're very eager to get things finished. And good handwriting takes time to write the letters correctly, and people just want to scribble stuff down. Very impatient. And I think that's one of the problems of our time is that we're just very impatient people.
And in the end run, this has probably increased our impatience and stressed us out.
I'll go along with that.
Not all good. Not all good. Did you discover anything in the course of researching all these inventors, a sort of thread that runs through them all?
Well, I think I discovered that there were certain key similarities between these inventors. One was that they were not afraid to be laughed at, is that they were ready to be accepted, that people would say, you're nuts, it's not going to work, why are you doing this? They would not take no for an answer when someone said it's not going to work, or they would then go on and go out on their own. They had an ability to work under very strenuous situations. I mean, the gentleman who invented the Xerox machine couldn't get it. No one could think of why anybody would want a Xerox machine. He worked in his mother's kitchen and under the pots and pans, and then she kicked him out and he worked in a beauty shop, the back of a beauty shop. He didn't want to take no for an answer, but he actually believed in what he was doing. And that's the third thing, is you really have to believe in yourself, so that when everybody else says you're nuts, you don't have to believe that. You have to think enough about yourself to do that. And then sometimes you just have to be lucky. I mean, some of these people were casting about for funds for 10, 20, 30 years until they found somebody. You have to be stubborn enough to say that I'll take as long as I have to find someone who believes in my product.
And you have to be able to sell that self-confidence.
Yes, you have to be able to, yes. I've talked to inventors of today's inventors and scientists, and I've asked them what is the common thread in their lives as children. And it turns out that it's certainly true in my case as someone who's interested in science, is that what makes somebody stay interested their whole life is, one, is that they had a parent or a role model as a child, a school teacher or a parent who encouraged them to be inquisitive and learn about science and not make it very, very ivory towerish. And second, their parents allowed them to take everything apart in the house. I mean, I can't tell you how many physicists I've talked to. Oh, I just would say to them, because I heard someone tell this to me once, did your mom let you take everything apart? Oh yeah, or I've talked to their mothers. Did you let? Oh yeah, I hear on my radio show, mothers would say, I have 3 kids who are physicists. I say, did you let them take things apart? I said, anything they wanted to. They could open it up and take it apart.
I think of my own child, at least one of my children, every time we went out for an evening, we came back and the fuses were all blown because he had tried to, wire some things together.
That was like me. That was like me. I was that kind of kid.
I didn't invent.
I didn't invent anything, but I was one of these kids in the basement who was burning things up and blowing things up and things like that. And I'm still here to talk about it narrowly.
And you didn't get terribly punished for it?
Well, actually, it was one case where I almost set my bathroom on fire doing an experiment I had seen in biology class. And it involved an alcohol lamp which turned over and caught fire, and this wall of alcohol, burning alcohol, was going down the sink. And I took out a wet towel and started beating the flames, and my mother hears this commotion and she yells, "Everything okay up there?" I said, "Oh yeah, Ma." Whack, whack, nothing. Should I come up and take a... No reason to come up
Please
here.
don't.
And thank goodness I got the fire up before it did any damage. And I think she only knew this once I started telling the story, and this has got to be 20 years, at least 25 years ago.
So you had a lot of sympathy for these folks as you were putting together the book.
Absolutely. I mean, I was one of these kids who did all the science fair projects and carried pencils in my pockets and things like that, which I do today. But I think that you just need to have an overwhelming desire to want to know where we are and how the world works. And I think that's really what these people wanted to do.
I have to tell you about 2 of my favorite inventions from the book, and they were Teflon and Velcro.
Why were they your favorite inventions?
Because because I'm a practical person, and they strike me as very practical things that I use on an everyday basis. Probably I've got some someplace on my clothing, and probably I'm going to cook with some of it when I get home.
That's right. And both of them were inventions that no one set out to invent. I mean, that no one sat down and said, I want to make Teflon, or sat down and said, I want to make Velcro. And of course, Velcro was made by a very inquisitive, the idea came to a very inquisitive guy who took a walk in the woods one day and noticed that when he got back, he had these burrs, these cockle burrs all over his clothing. And instead of just getting upset that he had to pull all these things off, people either see the glass is half empty or half full. They can curse the darkness or they can light a match. That's how 2 ways of basically I see of looking at life. So he decided to light a match, and not literally, but he took the cockle burr and put it under his magnifying glass. And he noticed that there were lots of little hooks on the cockle burr. And if you can do this yourself and see it. And out of that idea was the idea for Velcro, which is basically one strip of material that has lots of little hooks on it, and one strip that has a lot of little whirls on it, like a carpet, and you can stick it together, and it works. And it's an amazing idea, cribbed from nature. It was science imitating nature. And the other one, Teflon, was a total accident. I have trouble deciding whether you call it an invention or a discovery, because the scientists who discovered Teflon were not trying to invent it, yet it was made by them. In other words, they were trying to make a gas that's very much like Teflon, very much like Freon gas is today. And they had this big cylinder filled with this pressurized gas, and they went and opened the pressurized valve on it, and no hissing. There's nothing hissing that came out. They tried to look in it and see, and they weighed it so they knew there was something in there, and then they just sawed it in half, and out came this white little greasy powder, and it turned out to be Teflon. They didn't know what to do with it. When they looked at the properties of it, it had tremendous properties. It resisted heat and fire and acid and corrosion, and they decided to take it to their laboratory and experiment with it, and that's where Teflon came from. But it was not something that they had ever thought that they would sit down and make.
And we practical folks think about it for cooking, but actually it has some wonderful medical characteristics too. Tissue can grow around.
Right.
Teflon.
Tissue can grow, and because
It won't be
the
rejected.
body doesn't reject it, people have heart valves and blood vessels made out of Teflon, artificial kneecaps, things like that. And that also came out as an accident. No one set out to make these artificial body parts. That came out of a conversation at a cocktail party with one of the inventors who said, gee, if you could only make this, it'd be great. And the guy said, why can't we make it,
Well, this is a great book for the cocktail party. You read this book and you sort of feel like going out and sharing some of these wonderful stories with people at work or at the cocktail party or in the hall, in these big halls where you hold your informal meetings at work. And it's a fun book. I think about giving this book to the person who has everything but has a curious mind too.
Yes. I think anybody who wants to know how the world works or how the unusual side, the sort of the Alfred Hitchcock side of science, how things were invented, I think would be interested in
I
this.
have to confess to you that I took this book home and I thought, I'll just read one of these and see how it feels to me. And I read the whole book.
That's great, because
Yeah.
I've made the chapters short enough,
Yes.
so that you don't have to be bogged down in things you don't want to read. But and that's the greatest compliment to anything, is that you leave them wanting some more. Don't give them too much more. But it gives you enough of the curiosity these people had. And that's really a story of people. It's not really the stories of the inventions so much, but it's of the psyche of the people who had enough curiosity to continue on along the path they set, or to discover something where other people might not have, and why they and not someone else did it.
Well, and speaking of leaving people with more, how did you decide what to include and exclude?
Well, I tried to bring in the ones that would set off a light bulb in your head when you, hey, gee, I didn't know that story. And I actually developed friendships with some of the archivists at some of the great research facilities around the country, who would tell me, we have in our archives a story of, the fax machine. The fax machine's 150 years old? I didn't know that. Yeah, I have actually a picture of it. Let me show it to you. Or somebody would talk about who invented television. We have one of the old TVs here, or the TV was working in England way before it was working in here, and the British consider the TV people to be the inventors rather than the Americans. So I had a lot of help. And I also tried to include stories which show that these things are not made in a vacuum, that there are lots of people working on these things at the same time around the world. The British consider Swan to be the inventor of the light bulb, not Thomas Edison. He actually built bulbs before Thomas Edison. So I tried to give it an international flavor to show that these things we didn't always invent them first.
It's kind of like the map, where if you're a United States person, the old maps used to show the United States bigger than any other country.
That's right. And there are a lot of and we tend to get very nationalistic about these things.
Well, and that has an implication with TV, because, as you stated, European TV and United States TV is not interchangeable.
That's right. And when I tried to find this pantelegraph, this 150-year-old, I could not find any of that fax machine anywhere in the United States. I couldn't find any record of it. I had written all about it, and a gentleman in Quebec in Canada told me about it. I went to Italy and saw one in a museum. And only when I came back to the States and asked someone at the Smithsonian if they had ever seen one, and they said, we had one here for about a month. It's packed away. I said to him, can you just go take a picture of it? And he said, did you ever see the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark? He said, that's what this place looks like. So he never did take a picture for me. So I sent somebody back to Milan to photograph it in the Italian Museum, and that's how the picture got in the book.
Well, I noticed in the credits that the photos of these inventions come from many sources. It must have taken a whole research element just to pull those all together.
Yeah, that research element was me. I spent a lot of time in libraries. And when you go into libraries and you research old material, you find that there are a lot of conflicting things about history. I'm sure my book will conflict with the next person's book about these objects, because trying to actually find what the facts are about something is very, very difficult, because no one really can tell you, and you have to judge sometimes what you consider to be the truth behind things. And that's the toughest part about being a historian, in a sense.
Yeah, my facts and your facts.
That's right. Well, who do you believe about who invented this or who invented that? Even silly putty, which I talk about in the book. There's a great controversy about who invented silly putty, which had absolutely no use except as a toy. And I thought I'd gotten all the literature from the the company that sells and owns Silly Putty until I read in a technical journal a letter to the editor by the guy who says, we had the patent on that 2 years before these guys did. You know, it's like going to the beach. I love it because it's like going to the beach with a metal locator and finding coins in the sand. You go to these libraries and you find stuff there that are treasures in their own right.
Libraries are wonderful, aren't
Yes.
they? Of the Remington typewriter, one journalist said the world needed it. It had always needed it, but it never knew it needed it. And so that kind of goes back to your saying the whole cultural thing about handwriting and accepting needing handwriting, and that whole interchange that you see, I think, throughout the book of inventions interacting with human need and human need interacting
Yes.
with inventions. So inventions aren't always the mother of need, as has been so widely stated.
Well, no, they're not always. I still believe that necessity is still a mother of invention. For example, the Waring blender story. Salk, when he made the polio vaccine, used that Waring blender to blend together the ingredients he needed to make the vaccine. Now, if there was not a blender, what was he going to use? Or maybe the blender speeded up by X number of days or months or something of the vaccine. And so here was an invention that finally found a use someplace that no one would have expected. And in fact, the first blenders were not consumer items. They were not to be used by consumers in their homes. They were to be used in restaurants and places like that.
Like the microwave oven.
Like the microwave oven. So.
And I didn't realize that Fred Waring was.
Fred Waring, the name of the Waring blender. Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians.
Yes, the old.
I didn't know that either until I researched it.
And that he was a teetotaler, and he didn't use it for mixing his drinks, as one might suspect.
That's right. And he actually made a giant portable blender bar in a steamer trunk. He'd open up the trunk and he'd offer people these fancy, he's the inventor of these fancy fruit drinks you make in a blender. He loved bananas. He'd make these banana drinks and pineapple drinks and things like that. And he even enlisted his friends like Rudy Valley to promote it. So it's amazing where these ideas come from. And people, just because they're in one walk of life, they may be a musician or something, doesn't mean they're not interested in other things.
Cross-fertilization.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Did you find periods in history that were more fertile times for inventions?
I found that an interesting part about the turn of the century, 1900s, in terms of role models then, today, we have as our role models today, kids have role models, Michael Jordan, basketball players, football players. Do you know what people wanted to grow up and be like when the turn of the century? They wanted to be a scientist. They wanted to be an inventor. They wanted to be Thomas Edison. It's amazing to think about that today. Stars of stage stars, very famous stage stars, would have their pictures taken with Thomas Edison. Can you see Madonna going to find an inventor today because she wants to have her picture taken with somebody like that? But people as famous as Madonna at the turn of the century would go and have their pictures taken at galas given by these guys. And there were these great role models for kids to use when they want. Gee, I want to grow up and be like George Westinghouse. I want to grow up and be like Thomas Edison or Alexander Graham Bell. And they were making movies at the turn of the century. The first decades of Hollywood, you had movies about Edison, you had movies about Bell, you had movies about other inventors. Today, where was the last movie you ever saw about an inventor or a scientist, unless he was a science fiction
Seems
person?
like a better time back then, and our time has run out. But thank you,
Thank
Ira,
you. I
for
enjoyed
being
it.
with us.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.